Hey, and welcome, gurus, to this lesson, Azure Network Security Concepts. I'm Chase, one of your Azure training architects here at A Cloud Guru, a Pluralsight company, and it's in this lesson that we're going to be covering things such as defining what it is that we're talking about when we say network security. Then we're going to get into talking about how we can manage traffic with network security groups, manage traffic with application security groups, manage traffic with Azure Firewall, and then we're going to compare network security groups to Azure Firewall so that we can understand how these solutions are not competing, but rather to be used in unison for a defense in depth strategy. And then we'll round out this lesson with some key takeaways. So without further ado, let's get started by defining what we mean when we say network security. When we're talking about network security, I think it helps for us to get a better understanding of exactly what it is that we're trying to secure. So as you learned in a previous section, we have our virtual networks, which act as the private network for resources that we have in Azure, such as Azure Virtual Machines. And it's in these virtual networks that we have something known as routes, which are the pathways for connectivity through which our traffic will flow. More specifically, what we mean is routes that go to and from the internet or other networks into our network, as well as those routes that go between resources within the same virtual network. So, for example, from virtual machine to virtual machine inside of the same VNet. Now, these routes that we have come from a few different route types. System default routes, which are just there by default for our virtual networks. The user-defined routes, which we use to override those system default routes. For example, a user-defined route routing all traffic outbound for the internet for a particular subnet to a network virtual appliance, such as a firewall. And then we have our BGP routes, which are those routes that are exchanged between peered networks so they can better understand each other's network topology. And it's these routes through which we have traffic flowing, and we need to think about how do we secure traffic for our virtual networks for all of our routes? How do we make sure that these pathways for connectivity are secure and only the intended traffic is flowing through them? Now, when we're talking about network security, we have a couple of options for this. We have network security groups, we have application security groups, and Azure Firewall, just to name a couple. And these are the few that we will cover in this section. Azure Firewall will cover in more depth in a later section, but I wanted to introduce it at this point now so we can juxtapose Azure Firewall and network security groups so that we can better understand how these are not competing solutions, but rather solutions to be used in unison for a defense in depth strategy. So now that we know what we mean when we're talking about network security and what it is that we're trying to protect, let's move into talking about managing traffic with our first solution, network security groups. Commonly referred to as NSGs are our stateful firewall that we use for our virtual networks. And these have security rules that we use to control traffic. And specifically what we're doing with these security rules is allowing or denying traffic inbound and outbound for, again, a single virtual network. So say, for example, we want to control traffic to the internet or just within our virtual network between various subnets that exist in that virtual network. We can use the security rules to do this. Let's say we apply a network security group at the subnet boundary of a subnet inside of our virtual network. When we're doing this, these security rules that are associated with this network security group are going to be used to control traffic. And by default, we have traffic outbound to the internet as one of the default security rules. And this is going to impact all of the network interface cards for every single resource inside of this subnet because we've associated the network security group at the subnet boundary inside of the virtual network. Now, let's say we want to have traffic managed slightly differently for another resource inside of a subnet. Well, we create a network security group and associate it with the network interface of that resource, as we see here with NSG2. And we can use that to create a security rule to override the default behavior of allowing outbound traffic to the internet for that particular resource. So we can use these network security groups to control traffic, and we can use them with Azure Firewall for a defense in depth strategy, as we'll see as we move forward into comparing network security groups and Azure Firewall. Now that we understand network security groups, let's move into talking about how we can provide extensibility to these network security group security rules using something known as application security groups. So to briefly understand what application security groups are, let's use this example here where we have a virtual network, a subnet with 3 virtual machines, and each with a single network interface card, and a network security group associated at the subnet level. Now, as we know with the network security groups, right, we have default security rules, which we briefly touched on in just the last slide. With this, we have default connectivity outbound that is allowed to the internet. And let's say we don't want this for all of these virtual machines. Maybe what we want to do is deny traffic to a particular virtual machine, such as a database VM, if you will, so that we can ensure that it's not communicating with the internet and rather just communicating with resources that exist inside of our private network address space. Well, we have to think about if we want to create a security rule on NSG1 at the subnet boundary, this is going to impact all of the resources inside of the subnet. So let's say that these other 2 VMs are web VMs that we want to be able to communicate outbound to the internet. Well, we have to think about another strategy here so that we can provide those connectivity outbound to the internet while still denying outbound connectivity to the internet for the database VM. So what we do is create another network security group and associate it to the network interface of that resource and provide it with a security rule that denies outbound traffic to the internet. Now, as we see, this did accomplish our goal, but there's a better option here. We can provide extensibility to the original network security group using application security groups. And the reason we'd want to do this is, for example, imagine that we have multiple database VMs. Well, if we wanted to establish security rules for this, we'd have to create multiple network security groups and associate them with each network interface of each resource that we want to have this behavior of denying outbound traffic to the internet. And you can see how that doesn't scale well. Well, using application security groups and associating those with the network interface of our resources, we can use them to provide extensibility to our network security groups by logically grouping resources, and we'll use that logical grouping of an application security group. Think of it much like a tag that we will refer to when we're creating security rules on our network security groups. And we can use this reference to an application security group in the source and the destination of our network security group rules. And it's using this application security group that will provide us granular control of networks based on things like application structure awareness, so that we can provide security rules that are aware of particularly a logical grouping of resources such as our database VMs. And we would maybe name this application security group something such as our database ASG. Now that we understand how we can provide application security groups as a way to logically group resources and use them to provide extensibility to our security rules in our network security groups, let's get into talking about Azure Firewall. Now, before we get started with Azure Firewall, just wanted to provide a quick disclaimer that we will cover Azure Firewall in way more depth in a later section in this course. But for now, I just wanted to quickly introduce it so that we can use Azure Firewall and juxtapose it to network security groups so that we can understand how these are not competing solutions for providing network security, but rather different solutions to be used in unison to provide a defense in depth strategy for our virtual networks and those resources that we have inside of them. So to start off understanding Azure Firewall, I think it helps to understand what we're trying to do here. With Azure Firewall, we're trying to provide the security for situations in which we may have a virtual network paired with other virtual networks, or on-premise networks, or even other networks and other cloud providers using whatever private networking solution it is that they provide, much like Azure Virtual Network. In using Azure Firewall, what we can do is create a firewall subnet that is purpose-built inside of our virtual networks and deploy a firewall resource. And this resource can be our firewall that acts as the filter between our different networks, such as our virtual networks and other virtual networks that are peered, our virtual networks in our on-premise networks, in our virtual networks, and networks in other cloud providers. And this is traditionally used in a hub and spoke network topology where we have the firewall in the hub network. Now, Azure Firewall is going to be our place for centrally managing traffic for Azure resources across multiple virtual networks, as well as other networks on-premise and in other cloud providers. Now, with Azure Firewall, it's important to remember that what we are filtering specifically with network traffic is our layer 3 to our layer 7 traffic, which is different than what we have with our network security groups, which brings us now into comparing network security groups in Azure Firewall. Network security groups are specifically built for layer 4 traffic filtering. So what we're talking about here is a source IP address, a destination IP address, a source port, and a destination port, and a protocol such as TCP and UDP. With our network security groups, what we're specifically talking about is filtering traffic for resources that exist within a single virtual network. And we associate these network security groups at the subnet boundary and/or network interface card for a specific resource. And it's important to remember that this again is inside of a single virtual network. And network security groups come with security rules that allow us to provide rules to determine how traffic flows. And these rules are stateful, meaning that if traffic is allowed inbound, the return traffic is allowed outbound, and the same for the other direction, so vice versa. Network security groups also are extensible with application security groups, as we saw in the previous slide. We can specify application security groups to logically group different resources so that we can have more intelligent rules that are aware of things like application structure. Now with Azure Firewall, what we have is layer 3 through layer 7 traffic filtering. And specifically with Azure Firewall, we're having a central management place in this firewall resource to manage traffic across networks. And that's virtual networks paired with other virtual networks that are peered to on-premise networks, or even other networks inside of other cloud providers. And Azure Firewall is created within a virtual network inside of a purpose-built Azure Firewall subnet. And this firewall also has stateful features for determining traffic to be allowed inbound and letting the return traffic outbound and vice versa, much like network security groups. And the important thing to consider here with firewalls is that with our Azure Firewall, we have rules for network address translation, network rules, much like rules with our network security groups, right? Those layer 4 rules we talked about, and application rules. So you can see how we use network security groups inside of a single VNet to secure resources within the subnet, and specifically resources network interface cards. With Azure Firewall, what we're talking about is centrally managing traffic across multiple networks, not just a single network. And we have more features to provide those layer 3 through layer 7 traffic filtering on the OSI model. Now that we understand the differences between network security groups and Azure Firewall and what we mean when we're talking about network security, let's wrap up this lesson with some key takeaways. So the few things that I want you to take away from this lesson, if you take away anything, is that network security groups are used to secure traffic for virtual networks on either the subnet or network interface card boundary. And we can use something known as application security groups to extend the functionality of these NSG security rules, allowing us to logically group resources to provide application structure awareness to these security rules. Now, the other thing that we will get more into in a later section is Azure Firewall. But for now, we need to understand simply that Azure Firewall is a firewall as a service that allows us to be able to filter traffic layer 3 through layer 7 on the OSI model for our virtual networks and other networks that may be associated and paired with that virtual network. All right, gurus, that is all my time for now. Thanks so much for joining me in this lesson, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson.